Welcome to the Candida Chronicles with our host, Michael Biamonte, certified clinical nutritionist. In this podcast, Michael will answer your questions and reveal the shocking truth that the cause of most chronic ailments is not what you've been told. The source is Candida, a yeast overgrowth which, when it becomes systemic, can cause all sorts of seemingly unrelated ailments such as chronic fatigue syndrome and even weight gain. For more information on how Michael can help you, please visit healthtruth.com, that's health-truth.com, or phone his office at 212-587-2330. And now, without further ado, Michael Biamonte.
And hello everyone, this is Michael Biamonte, clinical nutritionist, with today's episode of the Candida Chronicles. And today we're going to be doing something a little different. In the last few episodes, we've been discussing some pretty specific things regarding Candida and Candida-related issues. Today, we're going to do a bit of a summary of some of the things that we've learned overall in the past, let's say, 30 years. And a lot of this material is covered in the first few podcasts, maybe the first 3 or 4. We've covered this material. We're going to go over it again. And we're going to look at it from 2 different viewpoints. One is, what do you need to do in order to get rid of Candida? And 2, what are the worst things you could possibly do if you indeed have Candida? So we're going to look at this both from the viewpoint of treatment, lifestyle, diet, etc. So of course, most of our listeners know that if you're going to get rid of Candida, you have to approach it in a twofold manner. You must approach it by diet. The diet must be low in starch, low in sugar. This is your pretty much standard Candida diet. There are many variations on the Candida diet. The reasons why there are many variations is based on people's knowledge out there on the internet, and also based on what they found worked for them. This is another thing that people will stress, is if a particular diet works for them, then they will recommend it to others. The problem with that is that everyone is an individual, and there isn't any one program that's going to work for everyone in a uniform manner. When you're taking into consideration diet in Candida, you have to take into consideration how bad the person's Candida is, what type of dysbiosis they have. Do they have also, let's say, bacteria and parasites synergistically with their Candida, which creates dysbiosis, which is a different condition than Candida, but it also includes Candida. Do they have leaky gut syndrome? And when we ask that question, the question is not, is it their opinion they have leaky gut syndrome, but do they actually have it? Because in reality, only 50% of the people who claim they have leaky gut when they come to us actually do when we test them. People assume they have leaky gut based on the symptoms and what they read on the internet, but in actual fact, only half will show leaky gut when we actually do test them. So that's a consideration, because people with leaky gut react very poorly to raw vegetables and particularly fermented foods. So their diet needs to be changed to emphasize that, as opposed to just the standard Candida diet. Also, the person's blood type comes in and is important, because the person who's a blood type A doing a Candida diet is much more tolerant of carbs and sugars than someone who would be a type O. The type O's are your typical paleos. They do best on the Candida diet, Candida-like diets, as a maintenance for that matter, but the type A does not, because the type A, having a history of being a farmer and eating a higher carbohydrate diet, will do better with a Candida diet that has a bit more complex carbs. So these are just a handful of factors that you have to consider when you're looking at the diet. But nonetheless, Candida diet is important if you're going to eliminate Candida. And keep in mind, there is no Candida diet in the world, and this includes water fasting, that will ever get rid of Candida. It's impossible to get rid of Candida through diet alone, because of the fact that Candida grows little hair-like villi, which would be the same analogy as the roots on a plant. And these little villi pierce the lining of your intestines to take glucose out of your bloodstream in order for the Candida to stay alive. So even if a person went on a complete fast, ate absolutely nothing, the Candida would remain alive, at least at the base of its structure, due to these root-like structures piercing into your intestinal blood vessels and taking glucose, which would be enough to keep it alive. It's not necessarily going to be in full bloom, but when you go off the fast and start eating food again, particularly sugars and carbohydrates, it will then once again go in full bloom. But nonetheless, the diet's important because diet does weaken the Candida by not feeding it and makes the Candida more amenable to the medicines that you use to kill it. One of the major things that has to be done when you're doing a Candida program with antifungals is make sure that you rotate the antifungals. Candida develops a drug resistance after about 21 days. What this means is that the mother cells of the Candida organism start to impart genetic data to the daughter cells after the mother cells are exposed to the same medicine to kill the Candida after about 21 days. It definitely takes a significant time after that for the daughter cells to become drug resistant, but it is the 21-day period, which is where the cycle, or actually the end of the 21-day period, which is where the cycle then really begins. So any antifungal can probably be taken safely for 21 days, and after that point you risk drug resistance. Now, it's amazing to me that this is data which is very easily available. I've been writing about this, and I've been using this data in my Candida treatment since 1990. Yet, drug companies and companies that make different antifungal medications completely ignore this facet, that Candida is very drug resistant. It very easily mutates and jumps to different strains. As I said in one podcast, back in the early 90s when we used to do stool testing right in my office with a very accurate culture that we at that point had imported from France, that we used to typically see that all the people who came to us who had been treated in the past by other practitioners for Candida did not have the strain Candida albicans. They would typically have Candida tropicalis or Candida glabrata, which are more mutated strains. It was the people within the practice who didn't even know what Candida was, who we tested, we found had Candida albicans. So this shows you that the incorrect treatment, which is so broad, leads to mutation in Candida, and you will not find albicans anymore. You'll then find tropicalis, which is one of the first more resistive species of Candida that the Candida albicans will transform or mutate into. So we must rotate the antifungals. We've been over this a million times, and this holds true. On our Candida treatment, we typically in the first phase rotate the antifungals 4 days. We usually pick 4, so this means 16 days would be the first cycle through, and we repeat that cycle until our proprietary urine test tells us we're finished with the phase, and then we move to phase 2. So that leads us to the next point, is you must have some kind of a test to quantify and document what your status is and how you're progressing. And this is where every Candida program, with the exception of the Biamonte method, is going to fail. Because if you're going to rely on blood testing for Candida, well, the antibody levels for Candida tend to wane or drop the longer the person has Candida. The typical patient who comes to us has had Candida for 10 years or more, and very often by the time they get to us, their Candida antibodies are normal or below normal because their immune system is exhausted and can't keep up that antibody production against the Candida. Also, if the person is still in the early stages of the Candida illness, what you'll find is that the antibodies can remain elevated for a period of 9 months after you've actually eliminated the Candida, which is very difficult to work with as a practitioner because that gives you no real-time information. What this means is after you have successfully eliminated Candida in a patient, your blood test will not indicate that it's eliminated for another 9 months. So that's a lot of guessing there. Stool tests, as we all know, are extremely inaccurate and produce a lot of false negatives. This is due to the type of specimen you're dealing with. You're not dealing with a liquid specimen, which is quite homogenized. You're dealing with a stool sample, which is not very homogenized at all. And because the stool is more clunky and chunky, you're not really getting a good representation guaranteed in any sample that you get. So, and this is goes back to a story I've told on another podcast where we had 5 patients who submitted a stool sample every week for 9 weeks to the then Great Smoky labs, the now Genova labs, and in each week the Candida levels were completely different. This was showing the complete erraticacy of the test. It's very erratic, produces a lot of false negatives. So if you're going to go by a stool test, it's just a total gamble. And this goes back to why sometimes you're actually better off treating by subjective examination, physical examination, or by symptoms, because the testing can be so erratic it could easily lead you astray. And if anyone wants to learn more about the Biamonte urine test for Candida, there are several podcasts and articles which cover that on the website. But for now, we'll just say that there has to be some type of viable test which is giving you some accurate direction on which way you're going. If you don't have such a thing, then it's going to be very difficult for you to try to understand where you are in the treatment and when to switch from one phase to the next. That's also covered in the podcast on self-treating for Candida, by the way, which gives you a lot of good information on that aspect and the difficulties when you try to self-treat without any type of accurate testing. Next thing we have, which is a major problem and mistake people make, is taking probiotics. Now, probiotics are of no use to a Candida patient until you enter the second phase of the Biamonte method, which would be when we have eliminated the majority of the intestinal Candida. People who take probiotics at the onset of their treatment are completely wasting their time and money. Probiotics do absolutely nothing except sometimes improve symptoms and other times cause allergic reactions in the Candida patient, unless you have eliminated the bulk of the Candida. The very simple fact is probiotics are not able to stick to the lining of the intestinal tract in the presence of a heavy dysbiosis. When you have Candida or other types of dysbiosis in your intestines, the probiotics are repelled by the bad microbes somewhat in almost like a magnetic fashion, and they're never given the opportunity to stick to the lining of the intestines. When you've eliminated the bulk of your Candida and your dysbiosis, that is the correct time to take the probiotics, because then the probiotics will stick to the gut lining. And at that point, once they stick, they prevent the regrowth of Candida. But the initial reinoculation of probiotics in your gut is thwarted completely by dysbiosis and Candida. For more information on this concept, because I know this is going to shock many people, there is a book that you should get, which is called Bifidobacteria and Their Role. It's produced by CRC Press. And this book covers this. This is the reference that I have that covers this pretty adequately and gives you all the facts on this. This is, of course, not what the companies that make probiotics want you to know, because they want you to take the products. They want to sell the products. They're not going to educate you on the exact use of the products, because that's not in their business model. I tell you this from 30 years of experience in doing stool testing, particularly on people with Candida, giving them all types of probiotics. I have hundreds and hundreds of case studies which show the probiotics don't adequately stick in the gut lining permanently until you've gotten rid of the bulk of the Candida. So the next mistake, by the way, in line with this, is the type of probiotic that one takes. There are many, many types out there, and by now most of the companies have caught up to the idea and concept that the only type of probiotic that's really going to work for a person is one which is human strain, which is also known as sticky strain. If the manufacturer of your probiotic can't confirm that they are making a sticky strain or human strain, then when you take this product, it's going in your mouth and into the toilet, and it's not going to really do you much good. Okay, so these are some of the major sort of do's and don'ts right now at this point. These are very key because if you disregard any of these items, you're going to end up with a situation where your program is ineffective or you're actually going to make yourself worse. A common mistake that people make, this would be one thing you don't do when you have Candida, is you don't take handfuls of supplements. There are two groups of supplements or nutrients which can be harmful to the Candida patient. The first group are the supplements which actually will make Candida worse. In this group, we have coenzyme Q10, we have vitamin D, we have the mineral iron. We also have calcium, to a lesser degree magnesium, only because magnesium would only be involved because of its role with calcium. Calcium can stand alone, and also the mineral copper. These are some of the important nutrients that you have to avoid when you have Candida, because each of these nutrients in their own way feed Candida and make it worse. For more detailed information on this, you can look on my website and some of the earlier podcasts where I go over this in more detail. Also, from another viewpoint, how we determine if a nutrient is worse or makes a Candida condition worse is by looking at the pharmaceutical drugs and by looking at which of the pharmaceutical drugs which are commonly prescribed for Candida block a nutrient. There are two, right off the top of my head, that I could speak about. Two pharmaceutical antifungals which are very well known, which their main action is in blocking the uptake of vitamin D to the Candida cells or blocking the uptake of iron to the Candida cells. And this essentially kills the Candida because it's not able to obtain those nutrients. So my argument along this line is, well, if the drug's mechanism to kill the Candida is stopping the Candida from getting these nutrients, why in God's name would you want to take tons of these nutrients if you have Candida? The second group of supplements, which is bad to take when you have Candida, are the antioxidants. Now, why antioxidants are bad is because most of them will act as antidotes for the Candida medicines. Most Candida medicines, one way or another, kill Candida by creating oxidative stress against the membrane of the Candida. Antioxidants, of course, reduce oxidative stress, and this then helps the Candida to be protected. The only substances which work to kill Candida without going through an oxidative stress type of mechanism in any way, shape, or form are items like diatomaceous earth, which we use on our phase 0 program for Candida. Diatomaceous earth completely and physically kills Candida by tearing or ripping or cutting into the Candida cells. There is no oxidative stress involved at all. The complete opposite in comparison would be any of the types of oxygenated products, ozone or biochlorodox, dioxichlor, food-grade hydrogen peroxide. All of these substances kill Candida by creating oxidative stress directly against the membrane. So they would be the complete antithesis of the diatomaceous earth type of product, or the type of product which contains high amounts of cellulose and protease, which kill Candida by digesting the outside membrane. Keep in mind, Candida is a vegetable. When all things come down to the most bare bones and basics, Candida is vegetation which is growing in your intestinal tract. And because it is vegetation, enzyme products that contain cellulose and protease in high amounts will digest the outside membrane of the Candida and kill it. They are not going to be subject to the effects of the antioxidants or any of the other vitamins. They will kill it independently. Those products are not enough to mount an entire attack with, however. They're extremely important adjuncts, and they comprise probably 70% of the phase 0 program that we give people, but they're not the entire attack. If they were, we wouldn't have to have phase 1 and phase 2. So nutrients, very important to be observed in what you're doing, because you don't want to take nutrients which are going to make your condition worse. Very often we hear from patients who call up, who are new patients, that they'll say that they heard this datum from our website and stopped taking all their vitamins and were shocked at how much better they felt. Well, an interesting thing was done years ago in my practice. We did very significant and detailed nutritional analysis of patients who were coming to us for Candida treatment at the onset of their treatments to try to get an idea how deficient they were. And sure enough, they were very deficient in many things because of the Candida's interference with absorption in the intestinal tract. However, with this group of people, we gave them no nutritional supplements at all. We simply had them do our Candida treatment standardly without any additional supplements or without any recommendations being made based on the nutritional testing we did. Sure enough, when we retested these people 6 months later, after their Candida was significantly lowered, we found that all those nutrients which were low on their test were now normal and dramatically improved. Now, we did not give them any treatment based on those nutritional tests. We just treated them for Candida. And this goes to show you that the Candida patient is essentially starving. The Candida is blocking his body's ability to absorb nutrients and utilize nutrients. So he is not going to be absorbing the supplements and the nutrients from the food. And the most A to B way you can help him is by getting rid of the Candida. Because merely getting rid of the Candida helps the person absorb so much more nutrition from the food they're eating that they no longer register as being so grossly deficient as they were in the beginning of their treatment. The next real no-no, again, this one's a bit controversial, is the treatment of toxic metals. Now, there are many practitioners out there, I've heard this very often from people who come to me, who are being told that unless they handle their mercury or their copper toxicity, the Candida is never going to go away, so they have to do that immediately. Well, very often I end up having these patients come to me because they will hear somewhere on the internet that I'm very much against that, and I'll explain why in detail. But these people, how I actually learned to become against that is mostly from this very cycle of action, having these people come to me and tell me that they were doing this with the doctor and they couldn't tolerate it or their Candida got worse. Very often we hear from patients who are doing mercury chelations that they'll develop thrush, they'll develop vaginal yeast, all their Candida symptoms will get worse to the point where they can't continue with the chelation. But yet the doctor is correct in telling the patient that until he handles the toxic metals, he'll never really be Candida free. And the reason for that is that Candida predisposes the person to the toxic metals. Copper, arsenic, aluminum, iron, and mercury toxicity definitely predispose a person towards Candida overgrowth. However, when you chelate those elements leave your tissues, they re-enter the bloodstream, they come out either in your urine or in your stool. And if the percentage of them that are coming out through your stool are passing through your intestinal tract, because they're being ejected from the liver and gallbladder in the bile that's being secreted, this bile is passing through your small intestine and colon. And the bile containing these toxic elements is going to be, let's say, the Candida will be exposed to these toxic elements. So when you're chelating, and you're drawing these metals out, you're actually bringing them back into the intestinal tract and exposing the Candida to them. When these metals are in the environment of the Candida dramatically increases. Each of these toxic metals has a different way that it increases the Candida's metabolism. In the case of iron, iron's an essential nutrient for Candida. In the case of aluminum, aluminum alkalizes the intestinal tract to excess, which is the pH swing that Candida likes. Candida likes to live in a pH environment in the intestines of over 7.4. When you drop the intestinal pH below 7.4, the Candida begins to die, and that's the whole purpose of acidophilus. because acidophilus releases different types of acids and hydrogen peroxides which lower that pH and kill the Candida. But when you're chelating out aluminum, and the aluminum comes through your intestinal tract, it's highly alkalizing, so it makes the Candida worse. Each metal has its own way that it does this. Suffice to say, the most important thing to understand is that when you chelate metals while you still have Candida, you make the Candida worse. This is a general rule. There are rare cases and exceptions to this rule where, using the Biamonte method, we have to address the person's toxic metals first or concurrently with the Candida treatment. The difference between my treatment or protocol doing this and someone else doing it is that we know what substances to give the person which essentially block the Candida cells from being able to absorb the toxic metals so that the person doesn't get that bad while they're going through that cycle. When you're a Candida specialist, you have to know how to administer metal detoxifications, how to administer hormone treatments, and various other types of therapies to the Candida patient without these things actually making the Candida worse. Because for toxic metal chelations, hormone treatments, whatever the nutritional process is, Candida patients react to them differently. And there are specialized ways of doing these treatments on the Candida patient, which allow the Candida patient to get more benefit than harm. But you have to know the tricks and the ins and outs of how you do this. If you don't, and you just approach the person in the same generic manner that you approach anyone else, the person's apt to get worse from your treatment. Co-infections with Candida are another important issue. When you treat Candida, you don't treat Candida singularly. It's very rare and virtually impossible to find a case where the person's sole dysbiosis is Candida. Years ago, we noticed that when we treated the person with very narrow spectrum antifungals and treated them in a narrow sense, we would observe that eventually they would relapse. The Candida would come back, not for any of the other reasons we've covered, but just for the simple reason that we didn't treat their overall dysbiosis. The make or break point of the Candida patient is whether or not his flora returns. If you can get the Candida patient's flora to return, then you've really changed his condition. If you reduce his Candida and you give him probiotics, you're basically compensating. But when you get the person's Candida to reduce down to being a fractional or marginal part of his flora, which is what it's supposed to be, and you get his normal flora, that the type of flora that you associate with taking your probiotic, to now again become the dominant flora, now you've really done something. You've changed, or you shifted his own intestinal ecology, and that's what really makes a difference. If you don't treat the person's dysbiosis while you're treating the Candida, this is not going to happen. Because parasitic organisms and pathogenic bacteria in the intestinal tract can be just as bad as Candida, and they can easily prevent the normal flora from returning. So you find that when you just treat Candida and you don't take any mind, let's say, or heed to the person's parasite overload or the overload of other bad bacteria that are there, he's going to get marginally better. He never really gets over the top because you cannot change his flora and the flora ecology unless you get rid of all the dysbiosis that he has. You have to get rid of the dysbiosis that we call Candida, that we call bacteria, that we would also call parasitic. And failure to do this doesn't produce a stable and permanent change. And this is the whole point. It's difficult enough to get rid of Candida in the person and get their flora to grow. But you're making the situation even harder when you're not paying attention to the other dysbiosis that he has. Another problem that will typically come up in treatment, and this one is somewhat esoteric, once the person has had Candida, there can be a certain amount of damage done to the intestinal tract and the intestinal flora that makes it harder for the probiotics to reattach and grow. There's very, very little written about this in the literature. Most of what I'm now explaining to you is what I've observed firsthand and from my own empirical experience in dealing with Candida patients. And this is not to say that this is a form of leaky gut syndrome either. This is not what we're talking about here. But there is a difficulty in getting probiotics to re-adhere to the intestinal tract after a person has had Candida. And there are certain substances which the person may need to take, which aid this, which if he doesn't take them, you will never get the complete re-inoculation of the probiotics. Some of these substances are commonly known, and they're some of the typical prebiotics that people take, like FOS, like fiber, things of this nature. Some of the items which are more unknown and rare in the public's ear are mucin substances. Mucins are substances naturally produced in the intestinal tract of all animals, all mammals in particular, and they act to form a protective barrier in the intestinal tract to protect the intestinal cells from flora itself. Mucins are a very thin layer of protection which stop the intestinal cells from being infected or reacting allergically to your normal healthy flora. The mucin lining is something which assists friendly bacteria to adhere to in order to repopulate. So when a person's on a probiotic program, it's sometimes a make or break as to whether or not he's taking a mucin supplement. There are a few different types of mucin supplements, but really any at all will do when it comes to this facet of what we're speaking of now. The lack of mucins could prevent the flora from re-engaging in the intestinal tract despite you doing everything else right. So this is something to be very much aware of. Another point which goes back to testing is how do you know when you're going to switch from one phase to the next? Well, we at the Biamonte Center, we have no problem doing this. In fact, we've written the rules on this because we have the urine test which tells us this. In other protocols and people who self-treat, they have no idea when they're going to switch from one phase to the next. In particular, what I'm referring to here is we would be in phase 1, which in the Biamonte method is the part of the phase which destroys Candida more systemically throughout the body. We need to know when that phase is over in order to move to phase 2, which is the part which destroys the intestinal Candida and the deep intestinal Candida. Then we need to know when to end that phase and flip to the probiotic phase. Now, it's going to be very difficult for someone to understand when to do that unless they have some type of test or some subjective way of understanding this and knowing this. If you don't do this correctly, then you're left with incomplete removal of the Candida, or you're left with probiotics that don't stick and re-adhere to the intestinal lining. So that's a difficult situation there in itself. So another issue that we typically come up against are people taking hormone supplements. Now, hormone supplements are very good. They are not bad. If they're bioidentical, they're very helpful. The rules in taking a hormone substance are, number one, you have to have a test which tells you that you actually need it. Because if you take a hormone substance which you don't need, you can take too much of it, and the hormone will then become toxic and turn against you. So before anyone takes a hormone, they have to have significant evidence that they actually need it. Otherwise, they're going to take it and it's going to become toxic and have the opposite effect of what they want to create. The second point, this is for the Candida patient. It's extremely important that the Candida patient only use transdermal hormone creams. The reason for this is kind of obvious. Candida lives in the intestinal tract, in the small intestine and the colon. And when you take a hormone pill, capsule, even a troche, what you're doing is you're exposing your GI tract to hormones. The Candida sitting in your intestinal tract is literally taking a bath in the hormone supplement that you're giving it. Based on what we know about the interaction between hormones and Candida, this is not a good idea. This could be a surefire way of flaring your Candida up. So when using hormone substances, it's extremely important that the Candida patient only take transdermal creams so that they're avoiding literally giving their Candida a bath in the hormones that they're taking. Well, we've covered some of the major do's and don'ts here today. Undoubtedly, there are more, which you will find in various articles and other podcasts. But I think these most likely are the standouts and the stellar ones. These are typically the ones that most people are ignoring when they do a Candida treatment, which is why their treatments fail. And if we have any questions, of course, as always, you can email me at drb@health-truth.com. That's drb@health-truth.com. I'd be happy to answer your emails. We didn't get any emails coming in today on today's podcast, but anyone in the future listening to this as a pre-recorded podcast or however you come across it, always feel free to email at drb@health-truth.com, and we will be happy to answer your questions. Again, we're celebrating the 30th year in practice at the Biamonte Center, and if you didn't see the newsletter that came out last week, for all our patients, we are offering a gift of the Biamonte urine test. If the patient buys one, they can buy the second one at half price. And that offer will last for the entire month of February as we celebrate our 30th year in practice. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this has been informative. And remember, we will be back on Thursday with our next podcast on the Candida Chronicles.
That's a wrap for this episode of the Candida Chronicles featuring Michael Biamonte, certified clinical nutritionist. Michael holds a doctorate of naturopathy and is a New York State certified clinical nutritionist. He is a professional member of the International and American Association of Clinical Nutritionists and of the American College of Nutrition, and he's a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the Clinical Nutrition Certification Board. For more information on how Michael can help you, please visit healthtruth.com. That's health-truth.com, or phone his office at 212-587-2330.